All right. Well, it's 2:30, and I like to start on time. But it's a real joy to be studying with you, Steve, as always. For those of you who don't know Dr. Steve Moffitt, I'd be surprised if there was anybody that didn't within our community. Steve is not only an extraordinary member of our congregation, but a wonderful psychiatrist. And many times throughout our congregation's history, we've turned to Steve when there are times of challenge to get his take on what we can do and how we as a community can respond to moments of difficulty. Not only has that been the case for Congregation Shalom, but I think in the greater community as well, whether it's Milwaukee Jewish Federation or the JCC. I think that Steve is our go-to guy. And for those of you who might be following, Steve has got a wonderful blog and following on that as well within the psychiatric community. Is there there's a link, right? Or there's the psychiatric news.
Psychiatric Times.
Psychiatric Times, in which you can read some of Steve's writing as well as published articles and books. And so we wanted, and by the way, the other thing that I really enjoy every year is this adult ed study opportunity on Yom Kippur that Steve has been a part of now every year for, I guess it's been, more than 10 years. I've been here 10 years, but longer than that.
Amazing.
And so I always enjoy studying with you, Steve. And this year, when we were talking about what we would like to study, and particularly what would be relevant and resonant for our community, we talked about resilience and trauma and resilience because of what our community is going through. Considering the fact that COVID has been with us now for over a year. And certainly the trauma of those early days sticks with us, but the fact that this is something that's going on for now longer than any of us had expected or hoped for is in itself a traumatic experience. And so we wanted to look at our tradition, and not only maybe our history, which I spoke of last night, some of the larger historical moments, but what it really meant for the individuals and the patriarchs and biblical figures who we can see not only the trauma that they went through, but the after effects of that trauma, whether it was some post-traumatic growth as something that we've been talking about probably for many years now as a concept, but also those who really withered also in the face of the trauma that they experienced. Steve, if you could talk to us a little bit about trauma, let's do the blessing for Torah study together, just as we always do. So Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, eternal our God, ruler of the universe, who commands us and sanctifies us through the study of Torah. All right, Steve.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I'm always happy to spend time with you. It'll be nice to spend time with you and everyone. So I wanted you really shared with me, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to share with everybody. What you think about trauma and resiliency, and what are the ingredients really for a successfully navigating trauma and to show our resilience.
Yes. First of all, thank you for having me again. Any study session, any educational session I do with you is among the most important of my life. It combines both the personal and the professional together. So this is really quite meaningful once again. And for those of you who don't know me, you may know my better half, Rusty, who's the beautiful blonde singing in the choir. So, when we talked about the possible program on Monday, what you brought up about the history stimulated me, I think, to put together kind of a model on trauma and resilience. And so I like to call this the tripartite model of trauma and resilience, resting on a three-legged stool. So I want to talk about each of those legs. And just first, go back in history. if any people were familiar with trauma, for better or worse, it's been the Jews. We ought to be experts in this. We've gone through so much and had to be resilient to be able to survive and thrive beyond dying during the trauma, right? And just for a couple definitions real quick, trauma is really, could be said to be anything that threatens your well-being and worse, your life. So it could range from mild kind of microaggressions that you suffer every day or bigger things like being involved in a hurricane. And we have an automatic response to that, and that is fight, flight, and I would add freeze. So you can have any of those initial reactions, but what makes us human, because animals do the same thing, is our thinking about this afterwards and thinking about it in a way that we could learn from the trauma and progress further. So resilience is then bouncing back, getting better potentially from the trauma, even though you don't wish for the trauma, but to come out better in the long run. And so what's that kind of tripartite model then? Well, the first part is the personal. Second part is the communal. Third part is spiritual. So the personal is your own individual strengths and weaknesses that might relate to trauma, including your own trauma history. And probably the people that are most vulnerable are children and adolescents, right? Because they haven't fully developed their cognition in order to process the trauma in a good way afterwards. So they have to rely on parents and other loved ones and friends. There are ways, actually, resilience doesn't completely depend on trauma. You can get more resilience even without the trauma. That is by learning ways to calm yourself, like yoga, like meditation, relaxation techniques, and really learning from your experiences. So you could even set up experiences that challenge you, that you may even fail a little bit by, and learn from it. So let's not assume you always need trauma to get more resilient. Then, of course, there's the community, meaning Shalom and other communities you may be involved in. And I would venture that anything that happened over these high holy days was going to help our individual and communal ability to kind of bounce back from the trauma we've been through this year with resilience, right? Ranging from the music to the sermons to our own individual meditation times during the services. I think all that helps us grow stronger. Now, there also are, of course, bad communal responses. If you've been watching the news, a typical example of that has been the gymnasts that were subject to sexual abuse, and the FBI didn't investigate that. So the communities they were involved in didn't come to their aid. Obviously, you don't want to happen. And then the spiritual, and you could put various things under spiritual. God, certainly, religion, anything that makes for transcendent experiences. My wife has a beloved saying, which is, be strong, and let us strengthen one another, which is said at the end of, I think, each book of Torah. And if you think about that, that's a combination of the personal and communal, right? We can be strong together and strong as individuals, and then also have the faith that God is behind us too. So these are the models I think to keep in mind. We're going to talk about the specifics. Rabbi Noah is going to talk about some historical figures, and then hopefully we'll have time for questions and comments that maybe will bring things up also to the present. So
Great.
Yeah. Over to you.
Sure. Let's look at some of the paradigms, right? Some of these historical characters or literary characters, depending on your perspective. And let's start with Isaac. And Isaac is a character in particular that over the high holidays, we were extraordinarily familiar with because of the Akedah, for example. I think it would be important to look at his early life as well. We know that Isaac was born to this larger than life figure, Abraham, right? And when we look even at the volume of text based on Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you look at Abraham and you look at Jacob, there's chapters and chapters of Torah on them. But Isaac, very narrow, very small. His story is not very big. And he's usually not really the one driving the narrative forward. But Isaac begins his life born to a 90-year-old woman and a 100-year-old man, right? But he was not the oldest child of Abraham. In fact, Abraham, when Sarai or Sarah was having difficulty conceiving, wasn't able to conceive, she instructed Abraham to lay with her handmaiden Hagar in order to then have a child, in order to make that promise of the fertility or that there would be descendants of Abraham come true. And he did, and Hagar bore Ishmael, the older brother of Isaac. And so Isaac enters into the world with an older brother. And there's a text that says that Sarah saw Ishmael playing with Isaac, and she becomes concerned that she wants Isaac to be the bearer of the birthright. Now, rabbinic text says that Isaac was being bullied by Ishmael, but they often, and we're going to maybe talk about this later too, often the rabbinic tradition will superimpose other ideas into the text itself, and that's interesting in itself. But believed that Isaac was being bullied by Ishmael. So Isaac, in a sense, from a very early age, loses his brother because Sarah sends Ishmael and Hagar out. A terribly tragic story that is also, by the way, part of the High Holiday experience, although we read a different text typically. And it's a tragic moment. And so from a very young age, one would think that losing a brother would be traumatic. Having not just his brother didn't pass away, he was literally torn away from Isaac. And then we know the Akedah story, in which we find a very passive Isaac being taken up to a mountain at what we believe was what Abraham believes is the bequest of God, to take his son and sacrifice him on the top of the mountain. And Isaac asks very few questions as he's moved up that mountain. He does ask the one question, I see the machpelet, I see like the knife, and I see the binding, and I see the wood, but I don't see the sacrificial offering. And Abraham says, God will provide it, meaning Isaac. And so Isaac experiences this horrible trauma of watching as his father ties him to a sacrificial altar and takes the knife and is about to strike Isaac down until an angel stays his hand. There's all kinds of interpretations of what that means. But what we do know is that this was a near-death experience for Isaac by the hand of his father. And so this is, again, a pretty terrible trauma. And it's notable, by the way, that it's never shown that Sarah or Abraham speak after that, right? So we have that textual tradition of the Akedah. Then later on, we find that Isaac is extraordinarily passive, like I mentioned before. When Abraham knew that it was time for Isaac to find a wife, it isn't Isaac that goes searching for a wife. He gets Eliezer, his servant, to go and to leave the borders of Israel, because Abraham doesn't want Isaac to leave the borders of the land of Canaan. He sends his servant, Eliezer, out to find Rebekah. And Rebekah becomes somebody that is, she's the person that really is, I'd say, the assertive one in the relationship. She's an assertive person. I'm going to keep going. I know there's a few other things that I want to just point out about Isaac's life, because I think that Isaac is actually an example of someone who isn't particularly resilient. And so, Isaac is pretty passive, and he has twins, as we know, Jacob and Esau. And Jacob is a guy that sort of is described as being somewhat meek and stays at home, while Esau is out in the fields, and he is like a Vildachai. He's out and he's causing, all kinds of trouble. He's a hunter-gatherer, while Jacob is more of like a homebody. And it's interesting because Isaac favors Esau, the strong one, and sort of rejects Jacob, who is the more passive one. And then on his deathbed, on Isaac's deathbed as almost the final insult. The birthright that he wanted to pass to Esau is stolen by Jacob, who dresses up, and because of Isaac's, blindness at the end, they fool him. So here's this character. And by the way, it also says that Isaac dug all the same wells of his father. And Jacob dug all of these other wells and was like this man who made a fortune. But Isaac really is meek in a sense. What does that tell us about trauma and resilience? What does it tell us about Isaac as a paradigm, like from his early childhood into his life? What can we learn from this experience?
Well, he probably should have seen a child psychiatrist way back then. But what's missing from his history is really this sense of communal help. He doesn't really have the help too much of his family. There isn't a big Jewish population, or really any Jewish population at the time. So there's not this communal help. I don't know how much we hear of his views of God and trust in God and so forth, but he doesn't have that kind of help on the three stools that we were talking about before. And the trauma is really extensive. When you have it in childhood and then add on to that and have triggers to that original trauma. So I think anybody who thinks he isn't so smart or so passive, I probably think that's the wrong way to look at him. He's really traumatized. And one way of responding to trauma is this kind of freeze response that I was mentioning. You just numb your emotions and kind of go through life and not be assertive. It's kind of a self-protective mode. So I think that's what he went through, and is a way to understand him and not be too critical, I hope.
It's actually really interesting because Isaac, in a sense, where we could find a commonality in history is this view, I think, of the establishment of the state of Israel. And you have people that have always, like when we look at Jewish history in Europe, often what was emphasized was sort of the person that was studying Torah, right? Almost in a very passive view of what our people might be like. And so with the establishment of Israel, there was an idealizing that took place among European Jews in that time, and also American Jews, continues to this day, of the rugged, the rugged Chalutzim, the rugged Israeli who is fighting off those who are in opposition to them. They're fighting to dig their hands into the land. They're very much like Esau, right? And so that idealizing that takes place among people who perhaps were victimized of that strong person that is going to stand up. It's not so unusual, I suppose, that Isaac would have chosen Esau over the person that most resembled him. Right?
Yeah, kind of the person maybe he wished he could be. And I mean, I think that's a brilliant analysis about Israel. I think my wife is going to get sick of me saying this, but I think looking to the future with a lot of hope, we're in a situation now where we've got a strong Israel, an assertive Israel, some maybe feel too assertive, and a strong diaspora. So this is really a time of opportunity for us, I believe, as long as we stay together and not splinter into different groups.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of assertiveness, biblical figure. Let's move to Tamar. And Tamar, we don't talk about Tamar too much. It is almost like it's a small vignette that takes place within the Joseph story. We move on to Jacob. Jacob becomes Israel. Jacob has his 12 children, leading to the 12 tribes, and one of those children is Judah, for whom most of us are the descendants of. And Judah, there's a story that takes place of Judah's children. Judah has a son who marries a woman named Tamar. for whatever reason, God is displeased. In the text, it says God is displeased with his son, and his son dies. According to Jewish law, and I suppose biblical law as well, what happens next is that the next son will marry this woman, right, in order to preserve, so this widow, Tamar. And so in order to preserve that lineage, it is then the responsibility of the next son in order to carry on the lineage through the widow, known today as Levirate marriage. And what happens is, and this is a little bit challenging to talk about, but Onan, who is the brother who then marries Tamar, really uses her for sexual gratification, but never makes it so that she could possibly become pregnant. And God becomes displeased with that as well. And so Onan dies. And so now Tamar is left with no way of carrying forward the lineage, which is, in a sense, what, unfortunately, because of the period of time, is what she was obligated to do. And Judah basically ignores this. He ignores what's happening with his children. So Judah, unfortunately, was a character, rather fortunately, was a character of great depth and a lot of, it was a challenging history. And one of his, unfortunately, one of his vices is that he would visit prostitutes. And I suppose that she knew this, Tamar knew this. And so Judah was walking along the path, and Tamar puts her widow's garb down, and she basically disguises herself as a prostitute. And Judah sees her and wants to lie with her, And so he goes and he solicits her, and she says, "Well, what will you pay me with?" Right? And so he gives her what is the sort of the staff which we call the cord and staff. This was the seal, the cord, the staff. It's like the identifier of one's identity that people carry. It's very precious. And he gives it to her, and he lies with her, and she takes it, right? She takes the cord, the staff, the seal. Later on, she becomes pregnant. And so because she becomes pregnant, people basically accuse her of being a prostitute, and they take her out to the gates of the city, and they're about to stone her to death, as was what would happen in that time period. And she says, I lay with a man. I wasn't a prostitute, but he left me with this. And she brings out the cord, the staff, and the seal, all identifying that it was Judah that had slept with her. And so all of a sudden, Judah sees this, and he understands that what Tamar did was actually the assertive thing to do, but also the right thing to do. But so we have this woman who's been traumatized, basically by this family, in a sense, from the brothers. It's a difficult story, for sure, from all of that sexual trauma that she might have been, and frankly, that interpersonal trauma that she would have been experiencing. But she does something about it, within the context of her community, and within the context of, within, I suppose, the mores of that society. She does something about it. And what does that tell us about her trauma and her resilience?
Right. It's such a different response from Isaac, as you say, and she didn't have the benefit of communal help, don't know about how she viewed God in this situation, or pray to God, or whatever. So she was really on her own. I think, by the way, then Judah gets traumatized at the end too. So, when I talk about that three-legged stool, one of those legs, if it's strong enough, can be enough. You don't have to have all three legs, but if you do have all three legs to help with the resilience, that's even better. But she had to do it on its own. And I think maybe people will think about how this connects to our current time, the Me Too movement of women, now the abortion issue. I mean, these things that we learn from the past just keep resonating in different form in the current time. So I mentioned the young women gymnasts before, and how they developed their assertiveness over time to be able to speak up as they did in front of Congress was quite remarkable.
Yeah. I mean, those of you who have studied with me for many years know that I mean, when you look at the narrative of the Bible, women always drive the narrative forward, always. I mean, it's fascinating in that way. I mean, the men, they don't, at least from a narrative perspective, they don't really drive anything forward.
They have more to learn, right?
That's well, yeah. I mean, in all things, it says, God instructs Abraham to listen to Sarah, right? And it's good advice. And so, how women assert their power in the biblical world was restricted, but they still did it. They still found the way. I think our goal is to be in a society in which women can be assertive, but through all the different avenues available to them. Let's talk about Joseph. Joseph is an interesting figure. Joseph spans many, many chapters of Torah. Joseph being the son of Jacob, and as we know, being his favorite son, which in itself is traumatic. We know that Jacob was a dreamer, and he used to dream of many different things. And the most famous dreams were of his brothers' sheaves of wheat and his father and mother's encircling him and bowing down, right? And he shared that. He made the mistake of sharing this with his brothers. He also had a dream that he shared with his brothers and his father of the sun, the moon, and the stars all encircling him as well, bowing down. And this is problematic for his brothers, who think, are you going to lord it over us? And so they hate him. They resent him. His father gives him a coat, a striped tunic that basically reveals favored status. It's given as an indicator of birthright. And they hate him even more. So his brothers turn on him, and they cast him into a pit. They tell their father that he's died. They present his father with evidence, and sell him into slavery. And he ends up in Egypt. Joseph, I'm going to share this one thing, though, that many people have perhaps looked at the dreams of Joseph as Joseph saying, I'm going to lord it over you. But probably a better understanding, and it makes more sense with the story as it ends, is that when we think about the circling, it may well be that Joseph actually was imagining being embraced by his family, like in a family hug. Like that all he desired, all he wanted, his dreams, were to be encircled by his family.
That happened.
And it happens in the end. Yeah. But it takes a long time to get there, and it takes a lot of trauma, right? Yes. I mean, his experiences in Egypt of being, sold to an Egyptian and then being accused by this Egyptian's wife of being raped by him, then going to prison, and his having to basically work his way out of prison using only his dreams. And finally finding his way into the Egyptian court and being accepted by the Pharaoh and brought into the household and given great responsibility, and perhaps finding the family and the community that he really needed, and then creating it for himself by marrying an Egyptian woman and having his children Manasseh and Ephraim and Manasseh, who were the only two brothers who ever got along in the Torah. This is a story of trauma, and clearly a story of resilience. But this young boy was seeking out community right from the beginning. What does it say about his ability, and what does it say about his trauma?
Well, probably it'll be no surprise that I find Joseph the most, he's the character I like best in the Bible. One might say he's the first psychiatrist because of his ability to interpret dreams, at least in a prophetic way. If you want to look at his childhood, you could think, okay, he ended up with a lot of narcissism, maybe too much. And of course, that's also in our news nowadays. But that narcissism probably also helped protect him and allowed him to really adapt to whatever happened to him. And as you say, he then found his own community. What also strikes me about his history is that third leg of the stool, the spiritual side, because in comparison, early on, if I've got this right, he attributed his dream interpretations to God in prison, where he didn't do that before. So he brought in that kind of comfort and strength of God in prison. And so he already had a lot of inner strength, maybe too much with his narcissism. He gets a community, and then he gets the spirituality, really. So he ends up with a tripartite kind of thing. And I probably shouldn't say this, it's way out of my realm, but I look at him as the patriarch of the diaspora because of what he was able to accomplish in Egypt.
I think that's actually, I mean, that's amazing. That's a really interesting thought. And I think because it is Joseph that led the people to Egypt. But interesting, just a total aside for 1 second. You know, when we dip the parsley in the salt water as part of the Seder,
Yeah,
actually in the Sparta communities, they dip parsley in hummus because hummus is kosher for Passover, you know, kitniyot. And the reason, you know, for us, because it represents sort of renewal and the tears of slavery, right? But the Sparta community dips parsley in the hummus because it's a reminder of Joseph's coat being dipped into the blood. And the reason that they dip it is as a warning. They dip it as a warning to say that it was when brother turned against brother that the people, that we got brought down to Egypt. That our slavery stems from the fact that brother turned against brother. And what's also really interesting about it is that it's the first thing that they do when they leave Egypt, when they're returning, when they want to go back to the land of Canaan, is that they exhume Joseph's bones and they carry Joseph with them. And it is this sort of beautiful indicator of carrying our past with us, no matter where we are, whether it's in the diaspora or whether it's in the land of Israel. We carry the bones of our ancestors with us, wherever we might go.
Yeah, in our minds. And you know, the ending there where he forgives his brothers is also a way to overcome trauma and be more resilient, right? And of course, it goes right back to Rabbi Pulaski's sermon that we heard this morning.
Yep, and it is, right, it is the, and that is also the fulfillment. That's the fulfillment, it's the rapprochement that takes place between brothers, is the fulfillment of Joseph's dreams.
Yes.
Right? He moves from being a dreamer to a dream interpreter to being the type of person through, I mean, if we will go through the list, through having a community around him, for being assertive, right, as well, for being a person of faith, can make his dreams come true in the end, despite the trauma of it all.
Yes.
Okay, our last paradigm is Moses, man of faith, right? It's interesting because I struggle with Moses being a man of faith because, in a sense, because I know that sounds weird, but because God spoke to him face to face. It's like, you know, faith is, I suppose, in a sense, and we'll get to this because I think you've got a really great take on this that you shared with me when we were talking the other day. You know, it's, you know, having faith in God is one thing when, you know, God isn't talking to us face to face. We experience God through our world, through relationships, through, you know, seeing our senses and experience of love and affection. But Moses had a very direct relationship. And so there was no doubt involved, I suppose, in his faith. But maybe there is, and we'll get to that because I think you had a good take on it. And if you don't remember, I'll tell you what you told me. But, you know, Moses is a man of faith. And let's look at his journey a little bit. Let's talk about the traumas that he experienced. First, he's taken from his home, right? And he's a baby. We know that he's an infant. But he's taken from his mother. He's taken from his father. And I think that it's possible that infants can tell that they know that. And so he's taken from his home, he's taken from his family, and he's brought into a different society. It's a society that has strata, like there's, you know, the Hebrews who were slaves, but then he was taken into the court of the Pharaoh and the Pharaoh's daughter. And what Moses sees around him is injustice, right? He sees the injustice that exists within his community and is so, I would say, traumatized by the injustice that he sees. It leads him to murder, right? He sees a Pharaoh seer strike a Hebrew, an old Hebrew man, a slave, and Moses is enraged. We know he's got an anger problem.
Yeah.
We do. We see it all through.
Yeah.
He has a terrible anger problem. You see, he becomes enraged and he slays the Egyptian taskmaster, and then flees and has to flee. And when he flees in the burning bush, it's the type of person that could see that there was a burning bush and has that holy experience. So not only did he have that early trauma of being separated from his family, the early trauma of being in an unjust society, we also see many disappointments that he experienced in the wilderness as he's leading the Israelites through. The trauma of the experience of having dwelled on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights to bring down the Torah, only to return to the golden calf being built. Disappointment, right? Then the trauma of having people rebel against him, the trauma of losing slowly his brother, his sister, then his brother's child, losing people around him. It must not have been an easy experience for Moses in the wilderness. So there's trauma after trauma. There's anger after anger. Tell me a little bit about Moses and his trauma. And do you want me to remind you a little bit what you said about the faith?
Correct me if I get it wrong.
Okay, great.
So, Moses may have also developed some identity problems, like who am I, as he grows up, and what does he know about his family of origin or not? So maybe that contributes to his temper. I think what I was reacting to is his encounter with God certainly should help with his faith, although I guess he questioned whether he was the person who should take over what God wanted him to take over. But probably what he didn't know, with the faith, was what kind of God was this going to be? How would he manifest himself, herself, however you want to call that? So, and we see that all the way along. Sometimes he disagrees with God, sometimes he goes along. So he's really finding out the kind of God this will be. And then at the end, he's faced with the disappointment, another one, of not being able to go into the promised land. Although, personally, I think it's still a pretty good ending because he sort of sees what's going to happen. He's almost there. And so, for myself, if I have that kind of ending, that's more than good enough, to be able to see the promise of the future.
Well, it is the beautiful paradigm of our lives.
Yes.
Right? For those of us who are parents, for those of us who are teachers, for those of us who are committed to society that goes beyond ourselves, we don't ever get to enter into that future, right? We don't ever get to see the fulfillment of the promise of the next generation. Right. We're always left at the border, wondering in a sense, but hoping that the next generation is going to succeed, perhaps where we fail, to build on what we have. And so, I when you said that to me the other day, it had me thinking, Moses did have many moments in which he absolutely must have had crises of faith. You mentioned his faith in himself, faith in his community, and faith in his God. That oftentimes they were, if you read the Torah, they sometimes seem like an old married couple bickering over the children. There is, in fact, one of my favorite moments in the Torah is after there's a moment of deep disappointment where God is basically saying, what am I going to do? And Moses points his finger at God and says, am I the nursemaid of this people? Right? So this idea that Moses is saying, it's your job to nourish the people. It's you're the nursemaid of this people. It's actually really beautiful because it's God in its most feminine, right? Yeah. It's Moses saying, look, it's your job. You're the mom. You should be doing this. So there are these moments of crises of faith because they're arguing. Yes. There is this arguing that's taking place between the two, and it's also at the same time a beautiful relationship. Yeah. It's a beautiful relationship that they have. So personal strength and community and faith. Does Moses have all of those elements that one needs, and according to your tripartite stool, that one needs in order to be resilient?
Yeah, I think he's got them, but the stool is a little shaky at times, so it's like if you're on a three-leg stool and you kind of move and put your weight forward, it becomes a little unsteady. So I think he goes through these times of unsteadiness, but maybe by the end it's kind of firm and he's ready to go. It's interesting to me too, in you're describing his relationship with God. It's really a different kind of relationship than Abraham had.
Oh yeah.
A different kind of discussion, kind of more familiar in a way.
Abraham, I think, is the initiator of arguing with God. He has one moment where he does, but it's Moses. It's pretty much continuous that they're in dialogue with each other. That there's this discussion. In a sense, God pops in and out of Abraham's life.
Yeah.
For Moses, it's like God is a constant companion as he's walking. As he's walking through the wilderness with our people, bringing us along. And it's pretty remarkable. And I think maybe when you talk about the shakiness of the stool, maybe in those moments in which there is that shakiness is the moment in which that's where the anger comes from. That moment in which, his response of anger, when his visions of the world are shaken, right? Maybe that's where it comes from.
Got it.
So we've got these paradigms for many of our biblical figures. And I think it applies to our community and the reason why look, in a way we were talking about how can we get through this, right? How can we get through the challenges and the trauma of these days? But it's important for us my senior rabbi in Florida, Sheldon Hart, was a remarkable guy, and I used to always ask him, like, when I would use the word people, he almost never did. He would always say persons, right? And I was like, it is grammatically correct, but it's such a strange. I was like, why do you say persons? And it's because people, it means a whole, but we're made up of individuals, right? So here we are as a community of individuals. And look, we're coming together. It's Yom Kippur. We pray together, and we pray as one entity, but we are all individuals. How do people who have all of these different, legs of the stool, some have three, some have two, some have one, some have none, how can we as a community with all of the different variety that exists learn from the paradigms of our ancestors and then be able to meet the needs of our current times with the resilience that we need?
Yeah, I think one of the things we can try to do as individuals, and I really like that idea of not using the word people. When the politicians use the word American people, I don't know who they're talking about. We are all individuals and diverse. And so each of us maybe can think about how are we doing personally as far as our own strength inside. What trauma have we gone through? Have we recovered enough? Do we need help? And if we need help, then we go to our community, the communal part. That could certainly be you, other people in the synagogue, professional help, and then to reassess your own spiritual beliefs for whatever nourishment that could give. The paradox of trauma is you don't want trauma to happen, especially bad trauma, but then it offers you this opportunity to grow and become stronger. A horrible paradox in a way, but going through this time of trauma from the pandemic and all that's going along with it, it's an opportunity, and it's an opportunity to grow. It's an opportunity to realize what we've taken for granted and be grateful for that. Gratefulness is one of the things that helps get over trauma and forgive other people that we've also taken for granted. So look at this as kind of an opportunity. And Shalom as a synagogue, whatever different opportunities we could give people to have the community help them out, whether it's education, services, new creative things, because we're in this kind of middle ground now of being able to do some things live, other things online. It's sort of be creative and connect with our congregation in different ways. So I would try to think by now the glass, we're probably, I don't know, at least halfway through the pandemic, hopefully, but but the glass being like half full now, and we could focus more on coming out of this in a positive kind of psychology way.
Mm-hmm. There one thing I just want to say, I'm probably inartfully, but I don't know how to say it. When it comes to personal strength, looking at community, looking at faith, the one thing that I think is essential in the world that we live in today, and I've noticed this many times, what I believe generally will lead someone to be successfully able to navigate the traumas in their life as opposed to others is their willingness to ask for help. And that this is one thing that I think is really, and in a sense, it takes all of these things. It takes personal strength to ask for help.
Especially for men.
Yes, especially for men. When you need help, it is very hard for men in particular, but people in general to ask for help. And if you don't, then you're not going to get the help you need. But in order to get help, you need to be part of a community as well. And you have to have faith. And I don't mean, necessarily faith in the divine or faith in God. I mean faith in human beings that are around you, that they will help you or that they're able to. Often I find that the times in which I have seen people wither in the face of adversity is when they're not willing to ask for help. And that's I think a message that I want to send to our community and to those who are listening, that asking for help is a courageous act and leads to, I think, being able to overcome. And I think, the tragedy of some of our ancestors is that they didn't have someone to reach out to,
Right.
but some of them withered in the face of it. Some of them were able to manage it through their own assertiveness. But most who really succeeded, and the real ones that we consider our patriarchs and our matriarchs, and the success stories of our people, they were all willing to ask for help or get help.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It reminds me of what happens with disasters. If you need faith in humanity, all you've got to see is how people respond after disasters. They're there to help right away. So we know we can rely on people. The challenge, though, is to keep that going. So people are ready to ask for help after a disaster. Others are ready to give it to them. And then it sort of goes away back to kind of normal life. So we got to keep in mind that we can help one another. We show it over and over, but then we sort of forget about it and think we're weak in a way when we have to ask for help. But as you say, it's really a sign of strength to do that.
Absolutely. So we want to give people an opportunity to ask questions or pick our brains. I don't know whether people have been asking questions in the chat because clearly I need glasses. So Brian, will you help us a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, we've had a few questions come through the chat, and we want to invite anyone else. If you have a question, please type it into the chat. I will pass those along. So one question that came in, and I'm just going to read directly what was written. Can you discuss trauma in light of the current pandemic, specifically related to failure and guilt? As someone in healthcare, I felt a wide range of emotions during the worst of COVID pandemic. At times, I doubted all my beliefs and felt alone. Is the thought of failure common as a part of trauma? It feels as though we have failed individuals and collective society as a whole. The loss of life at the individual and societal level were and continue to be overly profound. I also feel guilty if I want to resume some of the activities I enjoyed before the pandemic.
Oh, there's some great questions in there. But I want to start with one thing, is about the guilt associated with failure. There is a beautiful mystical text, and I can't really place it to source it right now. But that text speaks of the fact that God, before creating our world, had created and destroyed world after world after world, and that they were all, in a sense, failures. I think if you look at it like scientists do, failures are never really failures, right? They're basically instructive. They're there to guide us. In my sermon last night, I very specifically said, I never would have imagined the successes and the failures of this past year, right? And there have been many failures in this past year for our congregation, for us as individuals. And I feel a sense of guilt about those as well, because, but that's very human. And in having experienced the failures, it's informative to become better and to try to do better, or to find different paths or different ways to live our lives. When I first started at Carnegie, you were on my search committee?
Yeah.
I actually remember asking this question of Congregation Shalom. Because I remember it was the question that I was asked, like, so do you have any questions for us? I said, well, how do you feel about failure, right? If I'm going to come here, I'm going to have moments where I'm going to succeed and moments where I'm going to fail. So how, as a community, are you going to respond to those times in which we fail? And I mean, the answer I remember was, oh, this is a good place because there is the expectation that people are going to grow. And when you grow, that means you fail. And we all, and the truth is, we all know this instinctively because we all learned how to walk. And if we had given up on learning how to walk the first time we fell down as an infant, we would never be with, standing here today on 2 feet. So failure serves a purpose in a sense, I think.
Yeah, and you know what, I've told you this before. When I read your personal statement when you were applying, I said, this is going to be our future senior rabbi.
No.
You had all the strength, warmth, compassion that we would want in a rabbi, and that's proved out, right? I agree completely with you. Failure is a way to learn things, and it's usually a better teacher than success. Success, you kind of rest on your laurels. And of course, guilt has been a strong psychological aspect of being Jewish in history. Certainly our mothers, at least in prior generations, have instilled lots of guilt in us. So guilt isn't necessarily bad, but I think the important thing in the time of COVID is also, again, to emphasize the positive, the tremendous things that have been done despite the obstacles and despite the failures. The production of the vaccine, what healthcare providers could do despite all the obstacles, lack of equipment, putting their lives on the line, we still did that. So there's many more successes than failures. But if you feel you've had a personal failure, first assess whether you're feeling too guilty from it, but also what you can learn from it and then do better in the future, especially now since we're still in the midst of the pandemic.
And also among medical professionals, among all professions, burnout is a very real aspect of the work, and frankly should actually be expected. I think that people should expect, in a sense, that after, for rabbis, for psychiatrists, it's called compassion fatigue. For doctors, for nurses, for people in medical profession, I think it's different. There are different words for it, but it's very real. And I think that it is important to get the help or the care, the self-care that one needs in order to be caring for others. Just like when you're on a plane, they tell you, when the masks come down, make sure that if you're with a child, make sure that you put the mask on yourself first and then put it on the person that's next to you. Make sure that others. Right. And so if you are experiencing burnout, if this is too much, make sure that you're healthy, because this is, life, and this, unfortunately, COVID, it is a marathon. It is not a sprint.
Right.
So we have another question. It's another longer question, so I'll read through the whole thing. Many of these biblical stories allow the resilient characters to have some ability to move away from the trauma physically or detach from a situation long enough to figure out their next step, like Tamar. However, those people who seem to be stuck in the moment seem to be the passive types. I guess in modern days, that safe place would ideally be a psychologist's office. But what, if any, mental tricks can a person use to relieve him or herself if the opportunity to leave or find a way to detach from a situation to figure out their next step is limited or non-existent? This person is thinking of pregnant women in Texas who now feel they have little options if they have no money to get an abortion out of state, a person in a domestic abuse situation, or all of us trying to navigate a pandemic worldwide?
So it's an important question.
Yeah, very challenging. Yeah, leaving a place that's dangerous, physically speaking, is of course helpful. And we could even take that back to Holocaust time where you couldn't leave, right? But what we can do in certain situations is use our mind in a creative way. So it's really important after a trauma occurs or an obstacle like is brought up with abortion and stuff, is to take a step back and think creatively about what the options are and find allies, people you can work with and trust about this. Because too, whatever's happened so far isn't necessarily permanent, and lots of people, lots of organizations are working with options. So not to become hopeless for this situation, again, to look for opportunities. When we speak of our Jewish history, that's what's happened as we've adapted to trauma after trauma. We've developed this creative intelligence to be able to find other options for things. And hopefully that'll happen in our country even more generally now. I'm not completely pessimistic about the future with a couple of those examples.
I think from the perspective of Jewish history, and I think this aligns, in a sense with, I think, the advice that psychologists often give, is that when you're faced with a terrible challenge, you generally, and it's extraordinarily important. So it's not something that's like to be minimized, but it's a major challenge. You generally have two potential things that you can do. If possible, it's to change. If they're to change something, if you can change it, I mean, maybe leave, maybe flee, like some of our ancestors did. And the other, I think, is what as Steve said, in different terms, is how are you going to cope? Is the two options. You either have the option of change, or if that change is not available to you, then the other thing you have to ask yourself is, how will you cope? How will you cope with the situation that you're in? Our people were presented with opportunities to change or to move throughout our history, and some did, seeking opportunity in new lands, or in our biblical tradition, having to change their scenario. But there have been many a moment in our people's history in which they were forced to cope because they could not make changes. Whether it was during the Crusades, or whether it was living in pogroms, or whether it was living in ghettos where their space was restricted. One of the coping mechanisms of our people was to use creativity and expression in order to try to find a way to pass through that. Now, it's no matter what I'm saying here, I don't want to trivialize, because it's really, and to give black and white answers to really deep questions. But some of the poetry and some of the beautiful liturgy that we have and expressions of prayer that we have come from really dark moments in our history where people were forced to cope with horrible situations. And I imagine that their artistic expression was very helpful to that.
Yeah, by the way, I think you're bringing up another way of coping, which is reading and learning about other people's lives who have had to cope with trauma. I mean, the most obvious in our history is the Holocaust survivors and what they've written about how they survived and then ended up thriving. Again, not to wish anything like that ever again, but you learn from them how to cope with horrible situations.
And we learn from the ones that couldn't. And there were many.
Yes.
There were many who survived that could not cope with that experience too.
So there's a few comments in the chat that actually relate to a lot of what you were just saying. Other suggestions for people to keep in mind in case you're not following. For anyone else who might not be looking at the chat, thinking of things as a fail as a first attempt in learning. There's also something called EFT, the Emotional Freedom Technique. It's an app that you can use to help deal with trauma that you may be having. Also to connect with other people who are like-minded, which we just said. And you can find people online that now in this day and age of Zoom, there's people anywhere you can connect with. It might be easier to find that person who might be able to help. I want to summarize a few more comments that came in, and one more question just came. The other comments are thinking about trauma that brings people together. I think you were just saying this, and it can help us remind us that we're not alone. That this, many of us can be experiencing similar trauma, and the odds are that whatever people are experiencing is not a fully unique experience. And also a suggestion of, whatever the trauma that we're experiencing now with COVID, that we might not necessarily need to go back to what it was before, and how can we, go through this trauma and come out on the other side differently in a new place. So all of that has come through the chat. We also had one more question that I want to send back to you that just came in. I have recently become concerned with the way that institutions or corporations seem to be weaponizing self-care at a point in which people are stressed to the max for any number of reasons, short-staffed, politically polarized, and others. Rather than changing policies and practices to support employees and reduce stress triggers where possible, they talk about self-care. It seems akin to victim blaming to me. Do you see that mentality reflected in these stories? And what can we do about things systemically rather than individually?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I think if I'm reading the question correctly, or if I'm hearing it correctly, it would be almost akin, like let's say it was Moses in Egypt, right? What if Moses had engaged in self-care rather than tried to change the injustices of the systems that he saw? I suppose is one way of relating it. And I'm not, I can't see who asked the question, but let's put it in the framework of Moses, right? Like, what if Moses hadn't just, said, I'm gonna find ways to just care for myself, or I'm being instructed to find self-care rather than breaking the system that is unjust. I think that's a great question. And it does raise some concerns about, what sometimes groups of people do in the face of real problems.
Exactly. I also want to take the time to thank you, Brian, for managing this. I know it's difficult where you are, and also in the planning of this whole thing. So, yeah, this is a really complicated question, right? And it fits with our human tendency to scapegoat others, to blame others for whatever problems are occurring, especially problems that you may be causing yourself. But healthcare is so important, and so important in Jewish history to establish. We have this really fragmented, different layered system. So we can start even looking at the system. We really need a better system that is more just for everybody. But self-care, as Rabbi Noah has been talking about, is also so important to keep yourself healthy in any way possible now, because what's available, especially if hospitals are being used so much for COVID patients, is you have to rely on yourself and loved ones to take care of yourself as best as possible in the meanwhile. But scapegoating is such a negative human characteristic. It's important to be on guard with that. And we as a people have been the victims of that really for centuries and centuries. But we've overcome.
I think it's really, I'm going to just think about, I never think that it should ever be one or the other, right? If there is a problem, in a company or an organization of some sort, and we're talking about self-care. When I think about self-care, obviously, like there's like the sort of the maybe non-specific thing of just sort of spending time alone or sort of recharge the batteries. But I think self-care should be a little bit more than that. I think if people found help in their community or in an individual that can help them, like a psychiatrist or like a psychologist, help them navigate that corporation or that organization with the intended purpose of making positive change in the organization, so that it's not just sort of saying you go do self-care and then expecting that employee, for example, isn't going to then come back and say, no, I really do have a problem with the way things are happening in this company or this organization. Having self-care in my mind means talking to somebody who can help me. That's the way I sort of feel about self-care. And by the way, that can be all kinds of things, right? That can be a psychiatrist, it could be a psychologist, it could be a good friend, it could be a lawyer, it could be, it could be historic figures that I want to read about. But it shouldn't be just to basically tell somebody to be quiet, right? It should be, get some self-care, make sure that you're healthy, but to what purpose? Be healthy to come back to a functioning community, or is it be healthy in order to help that community then become healthy? In either regard, it's not good to do it alone.
You got it. I mean, the last step in recovering from trauma is to find meaning, and really new meaning in your life. What have you learned from the trauma, and put that into action? Self-care and helping others kind of go hand in hand. It's kind of a good feedback loop to do both.
And I think we've seen that. I mean, in our biblical figures, right? Moses, if him fleeing into the wilderness on his own after slaying the Egyptian was self-care, that's one thing. But he came back.
Yes.
And he made that society, well, he made it healthier in the fact that there were no slaves after he was done.
Yeah.
That is the type of self-care that one would hope someone would have, is that if they're in a dysfunctional situation, that they would care for themselves, but then they would return to put health into the system.
Yes.
Right? If you look at systems theory, you want individuals that are going to create health in a system.
Yes.
And it's hard to do in dysfunctional systems, but it is an important endeavor.
Yeah.
For sure.
That's where whistleblowers are so important, but you have to be so courageous to do that.
So I wonder, I know we're a few minutes over 3:30. I wonder if either of you have any final thoughts to share with us, something that you want us to leave thinking about as we go through the end of our Yom Kippur day.
So, I think that when we talk about trauma and resilience, in a sense, it's easier. I think that's one of the messages of my High Holiday sermon. It's like, it's almost easier to look into the rearview mirrors, right? It's almost easier to look into the past and see moments in which we were traumatized and then see the result. It's far more difficult to be going through a traumatic experience and understand the ways it's going to impact us in the future, and understand, like, how are we going to become more resilient, right? Like, I can tell you that I intuit, or I believe with faith and with hope, that this experience of COVID is, in a sense, going to make us more resilient, more strong when we get to the other side of it. What it's going to look like, that I have no idea. I don't know. But because I know that we have been able to get through situations that have been traumatic and difficult in the past, and we've been able to navigate it with a sense of hope and optimism, or that we've been able to navigate it, let's just stop there. Maybe not with a sense of hope and optimism, but we were able to navigate it, leads me to believe that we're practiced at it, that we as human beings can do it. And that's the sense of hope that I suppose I have for our community, for our congregation, really for the world. Human beings are we're hardwired to be resilient in a sense. It's part of who we are. It's part of our nature. And call that what you want, whether that's the divinity within us, or whether that is our human strengths. What I want to leave you with is the belief that no matter what, we are going to get through what is coming next. And we're going to be able to be strong because of it. When we break, when I was a kid, I broke both my collarbones, not at the same time. Actually, two different times. Once when I was tobogganing, because I'm a Canadian, and the other when I was playing baseball. And the thing that the doctor told me is like, once you break your bone, once you break your collarbone, it's going to grow back stronger. You know, that's, I think in a sense, that's just the nature of life. That sometimes, not always, but we can come back stronger from the experiences that break us.
Yeah, I broke my leg skiing, so we're together with that. I would bring up the possibility of self-empowerment, what you can do, yourself to kind of plan for the future. I think working on prevention is really important, whether that's politically, whatever. I think the difference with broken bones versus trauma is trauma can be invisible. That's why they don't give Purple Hearts out for PTSD, because some people don't believe it's real because you can't see it. I mean, when it gets really bad, you could see it, but you don't see it. So for your fellow human being, your congregation, ask people how they're doing over time. That always helps. We always say to ask somebody who's depressed, are you feeling suicidal? But way beyond that, this is a difficult time. Ask fellow congregants, people at work, whatever, how are you doing? I know this is a rough time. So ask.
So thank you so much, Rabbi Noah, Dr. Moffitt, for sharing these great insights into our biblical ancestors and also strategies for how we can continue and move forward as we're hopefully coming out of the other side of COVID and any other traumas that we might be experiencing individually or collectively. I do want to just make sure everyone is aware that the book of Jonah, the reading of the book of Jonah is available now. We're just after 3:30. You can find the link to that in the email that went out yesterday. And then at 4:30 in the sanctuary will be our Yisker service, followed by Ne'ilah.
Which, by the way, Yisker service is a great example of ways that we can cope with things that we can't change, right? Watching people come together and speak through poetry and through prayer and through remembrances of one's loved ones is an example of how we as human beings cope with things that are extraordinarily difficult and trauma that we can't necessarily make go away. Well, Gmar Chatima Tova, everyone. May you all be inscribed with an extraordinary and good and happy and healthy new year. Thank you, Brian, for leading us so beautifully. For those of you who don't know Brian, we should have introduced you. He's our Director of Lifelong Education. And it's a good reminder that education is lifelong. And we've got a lot to learn from Brian. So thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Moffitt.
And thank everybody who was on this Zoom.
All right, so that's good. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know whether we're off the stuff.